couple more chords. Well, let's see. Offense got to grow up. Well, that's good. Me? Got some other people coming. That's good. He's a big Florida State fan. How they're good. Jump off the ledge yet? Put up or show up.
There we go.
Should we go ahead and open the Genesis?
Yes, as a matter of fact. Yes, could somebody help hand these out? All right, well, glad you're here. Appreciate you coming. As we begin this new quarter, Austin English and I will be co-teaching this class. We're going to do like every other week. Will be one or the other. And the idea of this class is Austin and I have talked a lot about different things. We often get together, and most often over some delightful Asian food. And they always ask about the spice level. It's from 0 to 5. I get a 3, feeling pretty good about it, and he always insists to get a 4. And so I feel a little like, I think one time I did get a 4 and regretted it, so I always stick to the 3. But most of those conversations, I mean, they're quite brilliant. We solved world problems, and we should record that for posterity. But one of the things we talk about there is mental health. I don't know if y'all know this. He's LPC, right? You're all fully licensed, ready to go. And I am working on a Master's of Marriage and Family Therapy, still a student, a humble, lowly student. And that journey, hoping to be done, at least with the coursework by May, and then I begin a fun, long, enjoyable 2,000 years of supervision, of 2,000 years, it will feel like that, 2,000 hours of supervised sessions, and then I'll be fully licensed. So a journey. But because of that, I've picked his brain about a lot of things, and just the challenge of being human. It doesn't matter if you're diagnosed or something or not. It's just welcome to the human condition. It's just a challenge. And we're all struggling with it. It's all a difficult, it's just a difficult existence. And the relationship with self, the relationship with others, the relationship with our community, parenting, like you just make the list. It's just a challenging process. And because of that, I think both he and I, although we're, in the mental health direction, I think we're very convinced that the solution is Jesus. But although we're very convinced of that, the idea that we've been talking back and forth is, where is the intersect, if any, between faith and mental health? And so what we're calling this class is a peace beyond understanding, because I really like that phrase, because there's something very significant about it. There is a peace in Jesus that goes beyond just common sense. It goes beyond what one would expect. Jesus did this weird upside down way to see the world. And it's not what most people think is the way to happiness, success, the good life, mental health, whatever you want to call it. And so there is this weird tension to it, and this weird, and perhaps why it's often so difficult for us to do, because it's not the flow of what society is doing. So that's why we're calling it peace beyond understanding, because there is a peace in Jesus, but it doesn't fit just a common understanding. And then a little subtitle, Biblical Insight into Pain, Suffering, Mental Health. Here's how we're going to divide the class. So he and I are just going to go back and forth. So it's a quarter, 3 months. Our first month, we're going to lay the biblical foundation for what did God intend the world to be, what did God intend us to be, and what the world is. So, of course, we have to start in Genesis, which I was like, Austin wanted to start in Genesis. I was like, fine, if we really have to, I guess. I was like, I can easily make the same point out of Leviticus, but we're going to go to Genesis instead. So that's going to be the first month, is we're going to talk about biblical foundation to kind of set the big picture. Then the second month is he and I are going to use models of therapy, like ways to conceptualize it. And before you're like, psychology, it's just a way to conceptualize what's the problem, why is there a problem, what's the solution. And I think you'll find insightful that these different approaches to defining that, and then since we already did that theologically, we're going to kind of compare and contrast as we move along through those, okay? And then the third month, the final month there, is we're going to take concepts of the Bible like compassion, thanksgiving, forgiveness, there's 4 of them, and we're going to show you how that actually is part of what leads us to a peace beyond understanding. Austin, want to add anything to that?
Doing great.
All right, thanks, man. Appreciate it. So Genesis. Although you've heard me say a lot of this in different classes or sermons or devos or just conversations, posts I put. A lot of Genesis. I'm going to try to not just focus on this again, but to try to show you how this really plays into the concept of pain, suffering, and mental health. So, Genesis. Genesis is the book of just that, the beginning. And it's foundational to the story because it sets the beginning. And I know that might sound redundant, but why is an origin story important? Think about it. In a movie, in a book, in a series, why is an origin story important? Even when we're talking about superheroes, there's an origin story, and that's got to be told somewhere. Depending how creative writers get, like Star Wars, we start with the middle 3, and then we go back to the next 3, and then it turns out that the middle 3 isn't the middle 3. Now there's like 15 different stories. But why is an origin story important?
You don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been.
Okay, yeah, so there's that compare and contrast that kind of gives you direction.
Foreshadowing.
Say that again?
Foreshadowing.
Yeah, that's good. What else?
Lays a foundation.
Foundation. Mm-hmm. Okay, one of the things that Austin's going to talk about, so I'll try not to take too much out of this particular topic, is the idea of attachment. And attachment is basically this. The way you're raised plays a huge part into who you become. Does Anybody surprised about that?
Was my parents' fault?
I blame my parents, especially since they're not here. I just blame them all, right? It's all my parents' fault. And my brothers, but mostly my parents. So, no, but listen, but that is unavoidably true. There's no version where that's not true. And the goal there isn't to blame anybody, it's just to recognize that that is true. And so, inevitably, if you're doing therapy, you're going to want to talk about their childhood somewhere. You're going to backtrack. And depending on particular theory, there's particular theories that want to backtrack at least 3 generations. So we're going to do a genogram, we're going to talk about your grandparents, we're going to talk about your parents, and we're going to talk about what's wrong with you. And you can blame it your parents and you can blame your grandparents. And the idea there isn't, once again, blame. I'm just being facetious about this. It's really to track how one generation plays into the other. If you don't believe that to be true, go read the Old Testament, especially the storyline of Israel. One generation played into it to the other, good, bad, or indifferent, but it just did. And so this story is important because it not only is the beginning of the biblical story, it sets the foundation for our origin story of humanity, of why we are the way we are today. And I really believe if you don't understand Genesis, at least the first 11 chapters, you don't fully understand Jesus. But I truly believe that if you don't understand the first 11 chapters, you're missing out on understanding the human condition. And so that's why we start here. Okay. The historical perspective there is just basically this. Genesis isn't floating in nothingness. Right? There's a historical setting. And the historical setting, there's a lot to it, but the main thing I want to emphasize today or tonight is that there were other creation stories being told at the time. And this is important because Genesis is in direct conversation with those creation stories. And sometimes in a very heated conversation with those creation stories. And unless we understand that contrast, I think we miss out a little bit on what the significance of it is. Especially because the creation stories really wasn't just about my story is better than your story or my science is better than your science. It was a conflict of worldviews. It was a conflict of worldviews. You ever sit across a family member that has the opposite political view of yours, that you have, and you ever scratch your head and think, what's wrong with them? Yeah, right? Is that your Thanksgiving experience? No, don't raise your hand. And you're like, how could somebody possibly believe that or think that or see the world that way? Those are conflicting worldviews. It isn't even about that one topic. There is a broader worldview behind it. That if you deep dive into it, I don't recommend you try therapy with your relatives during Thanksgiving. That doesn't go well. One of the first things when I started this program, Becky told me is, don't you come home and diagnose me. So I was like, I would never do that out loud. Right? So, no, but the conflict of worldviews is important. And if you understand the worldview, then you're like, oh, that's why you do this. Now, you might not agree with it, but it gives you a setting. And so let me contrast what Genesis is doing in comparison to another worldview. And we could have gone several directions. The Babylonians have a story. That's the one we're going to emphasize. The Egyptians had a story. The Canaanites, the Amorites, everybody and their dog had it. The Assyrians, they all had creation stories. And actually, historians have found most of those. You can get online and read it if you're interested. So let me tell you about Enuma Elish, which is the creation story of Babylon. Let's put all this here. Okay, the creation story of Babylon. In summary, it's this. It starts out with water. There was this just watery existence. You're like, as a modern, or actually postmodern Western thinker here in Oklahoma, I would like to say, what came before the water? Yet they didn't care. There was water. They weren't worried about what you and I and most of our science today is nothingness to something, right? Kind of cause and effect. To them, they were fine with there was water. And that water is, almost think of like a womb, like amniotic fluid. And that womb was going to just like spawn a God, which was self-spawned. And this God comes into reality and looks around and be like, yeah, we got to do something about this. So then he spawns a couple other gods, and they start to create a reality. Create a reality. Here's the tricky thing, though. As they're creating that reality, there is something else in that water. There was this goddess of chaos, Tiamat, who happened to be portrayed as a serpent. And she did not want order in a world to be created. She wants chaos. So she comes out of the waters because in the ancient world, people weren't like, you know what I need? A house by the beach. Because in the ancient world, if you got too far out into the ocean, what do you think happened to you? Well, you'd fall off the earth. Well, no, that's a different problem, right? Like they wouldn't just venture out because that was where storms were, winds, darkness. You could get lost. You would die. And then there's these sea creatures. It was just a scary world. So to them, the waters represented chaos. Okay? So here you have waters. These gods come out of it, start building things. There's this agent of chaos in the waters, Tiamat, and she comes out and she's going to try to put an end to the attempted order. So then they're going to have this cosmic battle between one of the main gods who's going to take the lead, Marduk, and he's going to take the lead, and him and his other gods that come together to, fight, and Tiamat and her minions out of the waters, they're going to have this cosmic battle. And a lot of death, a lot of destruction. Eventually Marduk is able to just break through the lines, pin her, and just slice her down the middle and basically fillet her. And then once victory is achieved at great cost and barely, they will use parts of her body to continue creation. So there is something of chaos in creation. And because of that, she's gone but not. And if you've ever been to the ocean, especially at high tide when there's like kind of winds and storms, what's the ocean doing?
Eroding the beach.
Okay. Yeah, it's coming and receding, coming and receding. And what they thought of that was a reminder that chaos is still out there trying to creep back onto our reality. And if you get too far into it, it might just swallow you in. If you've ever gotten caught by waves, right? It might just swallow you in. And plus, this was important to them because it didn't take a whole lot in that world for chaos to just come upon you. There was famines and plagues and earthquakes and natural disasters. And then maybe the neighbors thought they liked your land better and they just come in and take everybody. Or somebody would sneeze and then all of a sudden everybody's dying of a pandemic. No, wait, that's recently. So, they just had plagues and pestilence and villages being pillaged and that kind of chaos. People didn't survive long, health issues and so forth. Okay. So, chaos. How about this story? One more thing. How do humans come about in this story? Well, okay, there was the top god, created a couple of buddies, and then, so they're the top, and then there is the middle class gods, going about their business, and then there's the lower class gods who were created to serve all the other gods. But the lower class gods got fed up with it and had the first cosmic strike. But even that, think about it, this is supposed to be the great spiritual world, and even then there's unhappiness, violence, and death. and strikes and like intrigue. And so they demand that the gods, the higher gods, create something lower than them to serve all gods. Guess who that is? Us peasants. So if you're a Babylonian child, Mommy, when I grow up, what can I be? Nothing. Can I be happy? No. You sure? Yes. Because you were created to serve, to be ruled over, to like appease the gods. And the gods were human-ish because they're like petty and cruel and vindictive, like all the stuff we are, but more intense and with more powers. And so how do they create humans? They get a middle-class god towards the bottom, like a junior god, chop his head off because we need something divine mixed with the dust of the ground, the blood, to create humans. So it's two worlds put together. But what animates this reality is the gods. In this case, blood, through violence. So then humans are created. But just like children, they're whiny and smelly and pudgy and complain and I don't want to and it's my life. So somebody needs to put the thumb down on them. So the gods created from the humans, within the humans, a very small group of humans who are representatives of the gods to rule over the rest of humans and keep them under wraps. And who would that be? If not the royal family, the politicians, the divine appointed rulers, right? And so they were in the image of their gods to control us so that we can serve all of them and the gods through our worship and prayers and, that kind of thing. So if you're a Babylonian, how you feeling? Unless you're one of the top Babylonians, then you're fine. All right. What about this other story? Well, in the beginning, God created. Okay, just already pause there. This story starts with what? What's in the beginning? Amniotic fluid? God. Okay, the word there is Elohim, which literally means spiritual being. So in the beginning, a spiritual being, you're like, what spiritual being is this? Good question. Let's find out. They're okay with spiritual. Of course, spiritual beings created stuff. But what spiritual being is this? I think it starts with a very generic word on purpose. Now, we just translate a capital G God because we know what God this is talking about. But as you're hearing this story for the first time, you wouldn't. You were just intrigued. What God is this, right? So in the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. I've made this point before. So if you're hearing again, how blessed are you? And if it's for the first time, then you're really blessed to hear it. Okay? The heavens and the earth here do not yet mean the sky, the atmosphere, or where the clouds are, or the birds, fly, or this lump of rock. That's later in the story. What it means, I think, is he creates two realms, the spiritual realm and the physical realm, where the gods live, the spiritual beings live, and the physical realm. The physical realm begins chaotic. It begins, one more thing here. So we normally think of heaven, like not the heavens, like heaven, okay? We think of heaven, we think of earth, and then we think of hell somewhere down here, right? Folks that are doing good here will float up into heaven, and folks that are doing bad here would just shake them off, and they go down to hell. Here's the problem with that. That's not what the Bible says. The way the Bible portrays it is the worlds overlap. However you want to think of it. This way, like they overlap and they mirror each other. To what degree, I don't always know. But there's places that talk about how what happens here is because something happened there, and what happens there is because something happens here. One example is the story of Job. Some decisions are made up here, and then some things happen down here. Because some things happen down here, certain conversations are had up here. Okay? So however you want to conceptualize it, it's not 1, 2, 3, it's all overlapping somehow. And there's moments where those really connect. Here will be the Garden of Eden, the tree of life. Other moments are like the burning bush or the Mount Sinai when God comes from the heavens to the mount. The tabernacle, Jesus. And then on the other side of Jesus, if you're baptized into Jesus, what are you? The connection of two worlds. Because the Spirit of God comes upon you. And then we are now the tabernacle, right? Our body is the temple. What does that mean? Is that God is on the move through us where two worlds connect. And what that meant in the ancient world is when the worlds connected, it's so that others could have access to the presence of God. All right, so hold that. It's really cool later. Okay, so sky and air. All right. How did this reality begin? So the spiritual realm, the physical realm. How does the physical realm start out? It starts out watery. You're like, ooh, I heard that somewhere. It starts out watery. And it starts out chaotic waters. The way it says is the earth now was formless and void. The Hebrew there's tohu vabohu. So darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Okay. If I had a little pointer, I don't need a pointer. So the word translated deep and the word translated waters is meant to be a contrast of two. It's a description of two experiences. What's translated deep is the idea of deep, chaotic, dark, uncertain waters. Becky and I once, are we still? Certified scuba divers. We were at one point, I don't know if that's lifelong. We were certified scuba divers. And we went to do some dives in Mexico, and one of the dives we did was a night dive. Shortly before we made that trip, I watched a movie with sharks in it. Not the best decision of my life. So we get off the boat into the water with flashlights. And because I'm also very curious, I turn mine off. And because I can see everybody's light, it's fine. But if you turned it off, you can get to the point where you don't know which way is up. Unless, life hack, if you ever find yourself in this desperate, you hold your hand, and if you can feel the bubbles, you know which way you need to go, right? If you can't feel the bubbles, you're going upside down the wrong direction. I feel the bubbles over here, you know. But that's just bonus. All right. So there's just this eerie feeling of that moment in the water in the dark. Like, is something gonna eat me? Can something eat somebody else if something must eat? Like, it's just this weird, like, it's uncertain. Now imagine that stormy. It's an image of chaos, of death, of uncertainty. Okay, so that's the word deep. This translated waters, it's the equivalent of you saying, and now you can turn on the water hose and water your garden. You're like, all right, how did we go from we're out in the middle of nowhere in the dark in a storm and the shark's going to eat me to I can water my garden and have lovely plants? What made it go from one chaotic environment to a life-giving, focused, gentle, watering experience. Extra credit, the Spirit of God. So, what in this story, there's still chaos, it's still involving water, and you're like, shouldn't there be a serpent-like creature in the waters? Spoiler alert, it comes in Genesis 3. But if you're in the ancient world hearing this story, you're like, ooh, those waters sound, yeah, I know what's under there. So, but in this story, what is necessary to take chaos into order? To submit chaos into order? Do we need violence? Do we need a cosmic war? Do the gods barely make it at great cost of death and destruction to pin chaos, and start slapping some of chaos around to create the world? Here, all it takes is the Spirit of God. Just His presence hovering. It transforms, it subdues, it submits chaos, not just into defeat, but it actually focuses into order, where it waters the garden. It's life-giving because God intervenes. And then what comes out of that, if not a process of creation? So when God's presence hovers over chaos, it is not only defeated, it is transformed into creation, into life, into betterment, into purpose, into order. We don't have time to do this, so you just have to trust me. In Hebrew, these creation stories, there's 3 sets of 2, right? That makes 6. And the way they're organized is like the first mirrors the last, and the next mirrors the next, and then the 2 in the middle. Like it's if you're reading this in Hebrew, you're like, that is organized. That is orderly. Even the structure of it. And I think it's making a point. This God isn't just a God who's powerful enough to defeat chaos through a huge war that is chaotic. This God's power is enough to not just subdue chaos, but to be orderly and purposeful on the whole process. He is of God of order. And to you, you'd be like, unless you're obsessive tendencies, then talk to, Austin afterwards. He'll give you some insight on that. But if you're worried as a civilization about chaos versus order, and everything about this God is orderly, you're like, even His victory is not chaotic. Right? You can have victory through war, but at what cost? Right? On the other side of World War II, was everything quite lovely? Man, there was things that had to be rebuilt from, dust up.
America didn't do bad. No, they had some big portion sizes after that.
That's right. But this God, His very presence is better, is productive, is beautiful, it's creative, it's purposeful. One other thing. And it repeats several times that God saw it was good. Why is it being repeated? If not to make the point that God is good. And God is intentionally good. And God is creating things that are good. One thing I'll say about this, because we won't spend too much time on it, except this. At each day, it was like there was morning and night, day 1, morning and night, day 2, morning and night, day 3, morning and night, day 4, 5, 6. On day 7, there's just like, and it begins. There's no end. Did God get lost and stuck on the Saturday? I don't think that's the point it's making. Did God lose track of 24 hours? I don't think that's the point it's making either. It's that whatever the day of rest was, it was intended to be an experience, a reality, a way of being, not just a nap on Saturday. Okay? It was meant to be, we've arrived. Now experience this. Now, that's going to get lost once again in Genesis 3, so then God has to institute all kinds of reminders that this mess, the chaos from Monday to, like 6 days of the week, is not the world God intended. So you have the Sabbath every Saturday, you have every seventh day, every seventh day, and they had all these different things. But all those were just reminders. The world is not meant to be this horrible mess you most often experience. So I'll just leave it at that, because I think one of the months we're going to have is about the Sabbath. The other thing, the light. This does not yet mean the sun, because that's later. I want to say that's day 2 or 3. It's later. So God exists, and then God creates the spiritual world and the physical world. The physical world becomes chaotic, uncertain. His very presence transforms and subdues this into a delightful experience, which is what Eden means, is delight. But before that, as soon as God's presence subdues chaos into now a gentle flow of water unto a garden, it says, and there was light. I don't think this means he turned on the sun. I think this means this is about God's presence, God's character. It's like God is a God of light. He's a God of not darkness. When God isn't present, you have chaos. And chaos that is dark and uncertain. And you don't know what's under there. There's like scary things that go bump in the night. And you can't see it. You don't know what's there. I'm reminded of Indiana Jones. Y'all, anybody? Fans? Okay. So that one, the Holy Grail, that you have Sean Connery, who's the dad, and at the very end, they're there on horses about to ride out, and Sean Connery calls Indiana, he says, Junior. And then, they're like, who's this Junior? Like, well, that's my name, Junior. And then he's like, who's Indiana? Indiana was the dog. It was a great dog, right? And so they go back and forth. But then Indiana Jones turns to his dad and says, Dad, what did you find on this? And he says, illumination. I think that's this. God's presence is illuminating. It's about clarity, truth, vulnerability, safety, innocence. It's just illuminating. And then it begins this. And interesting enough, much later in the story, spoiler alert, John makes that point about Jesus, that Jesus is the illumination of God. Why do we need that again? Because how's the world been? Dark and chaotic. We need God's illumination. When in John's account, chapter 14, when Jesus says, I am the truth. I don't think he's saying, I came to bring a better truth. Like, he is the illumination of what it means to be God and human put together. Okay? Right. Then we have in verse 27, so God created humanity in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. Then in chapter 2, verse 7, we have the mechanics of this. And the mechanics is we get the dust from the ground, and no violence is required. No heads need to be chopped, but we do need it to be animated by something divine. And instead of violence, what animates the dust? The breath, the presence, the Spirit of God. So we're not just created to reflect God, we are created with life given by God. Much later in the story, we get to the 10 Commandments. What's commandment number uno? Have no other gods before me. What's number 2? Oh boy.
No idols?
Yes, thank you. No idols. Why not? Why can't we have an image of Yahweh? Why can't we have a statue of God? Why can't we have a huge, lovely picture of God up front over there?
Nothing compares.
Nothing compares, yeah. No matter how artistic one is. Why else?
Start worshiping that image versus worshiping God.
Yes, that's true, and humanity did that. But there's one. Huh?
We don't know what it looks like.
True.
You're still worshiping the created rather than the creator.
Yes, y'all are thinking all very. There's more. Why do we not need an idol? Okay, I'll give you a hint. The word idol and the word image are the same in Hebrew. Why don't we need another idol of God? Because we already have image bearers of God. And guess who that is? A statue? Us. Us. So later in the story, when you're like, Jesus, he's God in the flesh, you're like, that's weird. Yet not if you've been reading Genesis. Because in Genesis, we are created to be two worlds put together. We are created to be human with the presence of God. Not only that, we are then empowered to represent God on this reality as he is cosmically ruling, right? In chapter 1 and 2, God's presence subdues and rules chaos into order. Here, when we get to this, verse 27, it says the verse right before that God created us to rule and subdue. Not each other, because in this story versus the story of Babylon, who's the special folks in this story? In Babylon is just the royal family. Who's in the image of God here? Everyone. Men, women, everyone. This would already just been like, in that world, like, what? What God is this? He didn't even have to fight. Chaos, just, and then he creates all of us. So if you're a little Babylonian child, right, you're like, well, what? Okay, but if you're a descendant, a child of this God, Mommy, what can I be when I grow up? You can be an image bearer of God. That sounds cool. So, why is all this relevant? If we were created to rule, to subdue chaos, not each other, because we spend too much energy trying to control each other. If you've been married, good luck with that, right? If my wife would just be the wife I need her to be, we'd be happy. I mean, not that I ever thought that, but I hear that from others, right? Okay, we spend too much time trying to rule our children, control our spouses, control the government control the people control the neighbors. I mean, we just spend too much time wasting time because that's not what we're created to do. And every time we try that, people are hurt. It's just hurt. We haven't done that well anywhere. Instead, what would it be like if we realized what we need to be controlling and subduing is chaos, is the darkness, is the uncertainty, it's the lies, because later in Genesis we get to craftiness, right? Lies. Here's where you can start. You know that voice you hear in your head? And I don't mean the voice that you go take pills for, like the voice where that says, I'm not pretty enough, I'm not good enough, nobody loves me, I'm never going to succeed. How about you start controlling and subduing that lie, that chaos, the within? We spend too much time out here. How about we start in here? Our origin story wants to make it crystal clear that we are created as image bearers of God, a God who by definition and by presence is against chaos, is transformative. It's about life, betterment, purpose, creativity, beauty, and illumination. So next time you look in the mirror and you got, all that, we need to start there. We need to start with that awareness. So this is of huge significance because it sets the stage for what's the solution. And we're going to get to next time. Austin's going to do a brilliant job of explaining Genesis 3 of what's the problem. But you already you can already see if this is what we were meant to be and we're not that, something went wrong. And spoiler alert, if we got chaotic waters, we got a serpent somewhere. Right? And it's going to be what later we'll get as evil. But here's a God that has always existed. He didn't spawn out of anything. Here's a God who created the realms, the spiritual realm, the physical realm. And here's a God whose very presence conquers chaos. Not just into destruction, not just into violence, into betterment. Right? Here's a God who, if you've ever wondered, why doesn't God do something about this mess we're in? First of all, he has and will, all the way up to Jesus. But here's another thing. Here's how God has always chosen to do something in this realm, through his representatives. You know who that is? That's a bummer, right? It's us. We're the representatives. We're the agents of betterment. We're God's solution unto this land, unto this reality. Now, Genesis 3, things are going to get complicated. But God's presence is about light. God's creation is good. God created all of us in his image, all of us. And let's wrap up with this. How should that inform the way we live? If all this is true, how does that inform the way we think of self? The way we think of others? Because here's four relationships that go wrong in Genesis. And to me, this is how you conceptualize what's wrong with this world. The four relationships that go wrong is our relationship with God, our relationship with self, our relationship with each other, and our relationship with our world. Those four things is what goes wrong. And those four things need to be done right. Okay? And so, if all that is true, how would that impact our world? How would that impact how we treat our spouse, how we treat our kids, how we treat ourselves, how we treat our parents, how we treat each other, and just on and on and on. This is of an extreme importance. Not just a cool little story for VBS. All right. So, any final thoughts? Austin, you want to throw out any nuggets here before we? All right. So next class, we're going to talk about Genesis 3. We're going to kind of take a little constructivist approach to it. So if you're intrigued, come back because Austin's going to do a great job. And I'm excited about this class. I think it's going to be a really cool way for us to just kind of walk through and hopefully make some very practical, insightful, illuminating discoveries. So let's end with a prayer. Dear God, we thank you for the blessed opportunity to contemplate your story, to see about the beginning and how this really sets the stage for the kind of people we were created to be, the kind of people we need to return to being. And we thank you for the path that leads to Jesus that then allows us to come back to you. Help us to be agents of betterment instead of agents of chaos, and give us illumination. And it is in your Son's name we pray. Amen. Thanks, everybody.